For this episode of A Pretty Lie Instead of an Ugly Truth, we have the legendary Dr. Jacqueline Battalora here with us today. For those of you who are not aware, Dr. Jacqueline Battalora is a passionate and engaging speaker who addresses the complexities of what it means to be white within a nation that opposed whiteness as a matter of founding law. She is the author of Birth of a White Nation, The Invention of White People, and its relevance today. She is also an attorney and a professor of sociology at St. Xavier University. In addition to that, Dr. Jacqueline Battalora was also a Chicago police officer. So the first question I have for you, Dr. Battalora, is how did you get into all of this?
Well, it really started I was a graduate student, a PhD student at Northwestern University, and as I was conducting research for my dissertation, I was looking into various legal prohibitions in marriage. And so I'm at the law library downtown and digging into laws, and I spent days exploring U.S. law, and then I was going back into colonial law. And at some point, something weird triggered in me, but sure. I couldn't put my finger on it. Like I actually had to spend a few days digging through these laws. And then I woke up at 3 a.m. It's like, oh my God, that's it. Like white people, this reference to a group of humanity, appears at a very specific point in time, but wasn't there before that. And in my own experience of being labeled a white person, that was really shocking to me because right. I thought that people called white existed as long as those of us had low levels of melanin in our skin.
Right.
I thought it was a thing.
Sure.
For as long as low melaninated people existed. So that was the seed. And truthfully, I had many other seeds. I had moved as a child from Europe, Antwerp, Belgium, to a small town, Victoria, Texas. And so I learned very quickly the racial dynamics in the United States, and was always troubled by
Sure.
what I learned. Played a role in it for sure,
Right.
but was troubled
Right.
as well.
Can you go into into depth in regards to the birth of a white nation, how this came to be? Take us back in time to give us that narrative
Sure.
so people out there can understand how this came to materialize. Because I was under the impression, and I think a lot of people out there may have been under the same impression, that the idea of being white or whiteness was something that was always chiseled in time, but we're coming to learn now, and I came to learn based off of reading your book, that is a canard and it's not true.
Well, the notion of people with low levels of melanin, or Europeans specifically, as white people can be found in little blips and moments all the way back into the 15th century. And
Sure.
the work of Ibram X. Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, is a wonderful exploration that includes information about that. And but what we do know is that when you look at the legal record, that laws did not reference people of European descent with low levels of melanin as white people until the latter part of the 17th century, and that it took place in colonial North America. So
interesting.
So there, of course, were people with low levels of melanin, but they were not conceived of as white, they didn't understand themselves as white, and they were not labeled white in law.
Really?
The legal record refers to them in the British colonies as English and other freeborns, English and other Christians, or especially in the criminal record, they simply made reference to someone's nation of origin, the Dutchman, the Irishwoman, for example.
Wow, I didn't know that. So how did this all come to be? Was there a reason that this materialized, or what
Absolutely.
was the specific reason as to why this, I imagine this is just the 1% or the select few decided to create the word white, or categorize or compartmentalize people into certain groups?
Well, of course, those with in the position of power to influence such a thing were, of course, the primary players there. But we have to actually take a step back before that'll make sense.
Perfect, yes. Can you walk us through that,
What we know,
how everything played out?
What we know is that, and I'll focus us in on the colonies of Maryland and Virginia.
Done.
What we know is that for the first 3/4 of the 1600s, there was a population boom in England, and so there were lots of poor people. The primary economy in Maryland and Virginia was tobacco farming, And so they large plantations had a regular need to replenish their labor supply.
Sure.
And so England had lots of poor people, and the king was happy to have them tossed in the guts of a ship and sent over to work. So they came as indentured laborers via a term of indenture. It was typically for 5 to 14 years.
And before you go any further, would you be able to give everybody back home a brief synopsis or a definition of what the difference is between an indentured servant and enslavement?
Absolutely,
exactly.
sure.
So I think there's a big misconception in regards to what that is exactly.
Well, there's a huge difference between the two.
Sure.
Those who came via a term of indenture, indenture itself was protected within parameters of British law.
Sure.
You couldn't treat indentured servants any way you wanted. There were limitations to how they could be treated. There were protections for them. Although it is noteworthy that the indentured servants in North America were treated much worse than indentured servants in England. For example,
sure.
in England, indentured servants could marry because they saw that as the way to produce the next generation of indentured servants. Not true in North America. And if a woman were unfortunate enough to become pregnant, they added 9 years to her term of indenture and 1 to the man's. So
women always had it bad. It seems like women have always had it bad.
It's true. Well, we could talk about that in a minute. That's
yes.
another whole set of laws,
right.
But that played a role in this. So a term of indenture was for a limited number of years.
Sure.
Enslavement, and we do know that the first persons of African descent were claimed as slaves by the shipholder, and that was up for debate when I wrote that book.
Right.
Yeah. In academia for decades, there was this dispute about whether the first...
I've read that. Most historians they're not really sure. They can't put their finger on it.
Well, now we can, because the ship manifest was found in Portugal just a few years ago.
What was deciphered? Would you be able to tell us that?
They claimed that they were, the ship captain claimed them as enslaved.
Okay, so they were enslaved.
So comparing enslavement to indenture is a very different thing. Slavery was neither prohibited nor protected by international law or British law, and slavery was for life. So a really big difference between those two statuses. But here's what's pretty extraordinary, and as I speak to people around the globe about this history, everyone really is shocked to learn that while that difference is a huge one, those who worked on the same plantation, whether from Africa or from England, were treated the same.
Really?
For the first 3 quarters of the 1600s. Yeah, they were treated the same on the same plantation. There were divisions, but it was along gender lines.
I don't even think we have that type of society. I mean, dare I say now? Would that be a far reach that everybody's like kind of treated the same?
We are much more familiar with the society that was created through the invention of white people than we are to what existed before it.
Sure.
For sure. So they were treated the same. So that's most people do not know that. I certainly didn't know that.
I didn't either.
The other thing that's surprising to folks is that free people of African descent were not uncommon during that time. And so people are like, wait, you came enslaved, slavery's for life, how can that happen? The historical record reveals that many were able to purchase their own freedom through side jobs, because many of the first people of African descent came from Barbados, which was already a British colony. They spoke English. They were acclimated to the weather, and they were accustomed to the grueling work of sugarcane farming, which is even more arduous than tobacco farming. So they had many skills. Compare that person to a person off the streets of London.
Right.
Not acclimated, don't have many skills, don't really want to work. So that person had many skills and was able to accumulate resources to purchase their freedom, that of family members and loved ones. Number one route to freedom. The other thing that we see in the historical record is that some large plantation owners in their, via a will or trust, freed those who they enslaved.
I see.
Yeah. And here's the really important piece of information.
Yes.
Free men of African descent had the same rights and privileges as a free British man by law.
Is that right?
So what did that mean? That meant that free men of African descent could vote, and they did. They could own enslaved Africans, some did. They could own European indentured servants, they did. They could run for public office. They had the same rights and privileges as a free British man.
That is crazy.
By virtue of law.
What changed?
Well, yes, so there was a big change. So this is what we know. that there was a huge rebellion that was begun. It was named after the man who started it, Nathaniel Bacon.
Bacon, familiar with the Bacon's Rebellion.
Bacon's Rebellion. And it was, and let me even take one step back before I jump into that. So it was, just to create the context of what gave rise to Bacon's Rebellion, it was kind of the perfect storm. There were, the king had given most of the good land, the good farmable land, to his buddies, right? So even if you were lucky enough to survive your term of indenture or purchase your freedom, there wasn't much land for you to find to farm.
So it's like it was old modern day nepotism.
Yeah, exactly.
Even back then, it stretched all the way back then, and it happens even to this day.
Well before, yes.
Right.
Well before.
Well before.
And the price of tobacco dropped. The king increased taxes. So there were so many people who were struggling. That population boom in England ended by mid-century, and so the large plantation owners were absolutely panicked about how they're going to replenish their labor supply, because the vast majority of human beings in these colonies were poor British men, the vast majority. And so what was beginning to happen, because the plantation owners were panicked, was that they began to impose really harsh punishments on indentured and enslaved people for really minor infractions.
I see.
So trying to hold on. So there were lots of unhappy people at this moment, small farmers and the like. And so Nathaniel Bacon didn't really have to look hard to find disgruntled, unhappy people.
It was easy for him to find these individuals because everybody was already mad as it is.
Absolutely. And so what happened, sort of the trigger point, was that Nathaniel Bacon believed that some of his neighbors' indentured servants had been murdered by a surrounding Native American tribe. And he was furious that Governor Berkeley didn't respond violently. And so the first phase of Bacon's Rebellion was, in fact, an assault on friendly and unfriendly Native American people. So,
I see.
Yeah, so that's a really unfortunate piece of Bacon's Rebellion. But the second piece of it was an outright assault on the ruling elite in Virginia, who at the time when so many people in the colony were struggling, there were a few who were getting very, very rich.
Right.
And so they really rebelled against the ruling elite. The rebellion was, it was enormous. It lasted well over a year, and ultimately it wasn't quashed until the English sent in troops. So, and what we know, and we know this largely from the work of Theodore Allen, he digs into the written communication between the Legal Oversight Authority in Virginia and, in England and the ruling elite in Virginia, like their communications going back and forth. And we learn from his research that lots of ruling elite in the colonies, not just those two, were really concerned and feeling insecure in light of Bacon's Rebellion. But perhaps the most important thing that we learned from that research is that the lawmakers in Virginia, once the rebellion was quashed, told their corporate shareholders, because Virginia was a corporation, don't worry, we've got this under control. We are going to pursue a divide and conquer strategy. And it is what follows that creates society that you and I will recognize.
I see.
And it is in this moment that we see for the first time in law a group of people called white people appearing in the laws themselves. So this is what happens. They are pursuing a divide and conquer strategy. So the 99% who up until this moment had really been united and viewed each other and experienced each other as similar, that will never be the same and never has been the same. And what created this new society where the 99% see ourselves as different races, different in all these ways that keep us from ever focusing on the 1%, were a slew of laws we see after Bacon's Rebellion. Laws that made it illegal for a person of African descent from running for public office, prohibited white people from marrying people of African descent, members of native tribes, and we see that law throughout U.S. history, and it prohibits only white people. It's not about prohibiting interracial marriages. Anti-miscegenation law is what that's called. We're only concerned with white people. right? So a person of Native American descent could marry, let's say, a person of Chinese descent, even though both were understood through most of U.S. history up until today, frankly, as racially different and distinct.
Sure.
But anti-miscegenation law didn't care about that. It only cared about white people.
So what you're saying is essentially, I just want to get this straight, the purpose of creating the idea of white people was 150% created to divide. That's it.
White people only exist for two purposes: to divide and to dominate.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And we know there are two laws that are really informative about this new assertion of this group called white people, at least as intended by those who first asserted it.
Right.
Okay, so there is a law in Maryland of 1664, and this particular law punished British and other freeborn women who married enslaved Negro men, was the language of the law. And the punishment was pretty severe. The woman is enslaved for the duration of her husband's life. Any children that they have are enslaved. And so the lawmakers claim that the intent of the law is to deter these, quote, shameful matches. They go on to say that these British women clearly must be forgetful of their status, and then go on to explain that the English are, quote, deserving of rights and privileges from which others can be denied, end quote. So we learn in the dicta of that law of 1664, which is the explanation for why they're passing it in the first place, that they view these marriages as an affront to the British people, right? The affront isn't to an individual, which is usually the case, especially in criminal law,
Right.
but rather to a people, a collective people. And it's really important because the opposite happened after they created that law. What happened was those marriages increased.
They skyrocketed.
They didn't decrease.
Despite the harsh
Well,
punishments.
sure, because put yourself in the position of a plantation owner. What do you think about that law? Woohoo, right?
Right,
Wonderful. As
right.
soon as she says I do, I just gained more, my property value just went up.
Right.
And then if they have children, it goes up more. And that's exactly what happened.
Right.
So it wasn't until 1681 that Maryland lawmakers finally amend that law. And it is in this law that we see that English and other white women, it's the first appearance in law that references a group of humanity called white people. But this time they got it right because they punished in the law anyone found to have encouraged the marriage, and also the person who performed the marriage.
Would you be so kind, Dr. Battalora, to tell us about the impetus of that law in 1664?
Sure. Well, an important piece of information to understand is that in both the colonies of Maryland and Virginia, there was a dramatic gender imbalance. There was roughly 8 to 12, depends on whose history you read.
Sure.
Men for every one woman. So a dramatic gender imbalance. Women could have their...
Can you say that one more time? I beg your pardon.
Sure. There were roughly 8 to 12 men for every woman.
Wow.
Yeah, so a huge gender imbalance. And so that likely was part of the impetus for that law that viewed white women who married enslaved men of African descent being perceived as such an affront to these elite British men.
So what you're saying is, I'm just so I can get this correct, You're essentially saying that the reason why some of these laws, and correct me if I'm wrong, were created was because some of these British elites who had all of their money and all of their power and all of this still were not able to attract or keep the white women that they had. So in response to that, because the majority of the women were still marrying slaves or indentures who were not even of the same social economical status at the time, they created laws that purposely prohibited them from marrying those individuals, kind of like a kid with his own basketball getting mad, taking it and running home when he doesn't get his ways. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it was a piece of it. I think it was a piece of it, but the primary motivation for the invention of this group of humanity called white people was to ensure that the 99% would be divided. So that was absolutely the impetus for the invention of white people. I do think, I can't speak to the personal lives of the initial lawmakers.
Right.
I suspect that they were solid, but I think they viewed it as an affront, seeing these British women marrying an enslaved person. I think in their explanation for the purpose of the law, it's revealed that they saw it as an affront to us British people. Like,
right.
Why would you marry an enslaved person?
Right.
You know?
Over me.
Yes.
Right.
Over my son, over my
right, or whoever.
Right. Even over, yeah. So we went from a moment in colonial North America, in these colonies of Maryland and Virginia, where people of African descent and people of European descent, except for the very big difference of coming enslaved versus coming indentured, were treated the same on the same plantation, and upon accomplishing freedom, experienced life with the same rights and opportunities, to now an entirely new society crafted, one where, and what's so crazy about this new social order that they put into place through these bundles of laws,
sure.
And I want to touch on three of them in particular.
Please do.
So one of the laws, aside from white people being prohibited from marrying people of African descent and members of native tribes, which was the law in Virginia.
I have a question for you before you go into that.
Sure.
Could they marry people of African descent?
No. And the Virginia law applied to both white men and white women, although it was rarely enforced against white men.
Oh, so if they did do it, hypothetically speaking, the ramifications for them was almost non-existent.
That's correct. So it was largely a control mechanism, making white women exclusive to white men and truly all women available to white men. Right, and so it was to control white women and non-white men.
This is absurd.
Their relationality and their sexual. Well, it persists today.
Sure.
Right, it's not like that has left this society. I mean, look.
Can you give an example?
Well, yeah. Let me give the historical, and then we'll jump into contemporary. For more than 300 years, this law called the anti-miscegenation law that prohibited white people from marrying always people of African descent and sometimes various others, depending on the demographics of a region, lasted more than 300 years. It was finally found to be unconstitutional in 1967 in the case called Loving versus Virginia that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. So these ideas about white women worked to shape a notion of them as us as embodying white purity, right? Because white men couldn't. They were sexually assaulting, sometimes having perhaps relationships that weren't of an assault nature with some of the African women that they enslaved. So white women's bodies literally became the way in which whiteness was reproduced. And so we still see that today. Let me tell you how what evidence I have of that.
Of course.
Part of what I do in my classrooms, and it's not until the end of the classroom where my students know that I am not against white people.
Right. That's not your position at all.
No, we've learned, we were made white. Like whiteness, this terrible oppressive thing that taught me from the moment of my birth to divide and dominate. Divide and dominate. And that's what a terrible thing to realize is attached to this thing we call a race identity.
Right.
So when I'm pretty far along in a class, students know that I am not about. I don't share this information with us so that we can beat up white people.
Right.
My hope is that this understanding helps us to be able to address the very real problems that are in our moment, right? We're sending our students out there and saying, okay, why are all of these white police officers shooting these unarmed men of color? Go solve it. They don't have the tools to solve it because they don't understand what created that in the first place. So if I could tag off of that and go back to a couple of the laws that were first passed, I think it helps impress upon us how important this history is to know. So there were bundles of laws that were now being passed that just radically reorganized society. And one of the very first laws passed made it or prohibited people of African descent from testifying against a white person.
That is crazy.
It is. And so when I was sort of digging into the history of this moment, I kept thinking, well, let's say I was a woman from Scotland. What, am I white?
Right.
And I don't know, we know that the British people are understood as white.
Right.
But who else is white?
Right.
And then, like, what did it mean to be white?
Right.
But if you look at just some of the very first laws, it's really clear what it means to be white. In terms of who is white, that has never, to this day, been defined as a matter of federal law. Even though we have laws from the founding of this country that turn on whether you're white or not.
Right.
Never
right.
defined it. So what that meant is the determination of who is white would be something fought out in courts.
That's absurd.
Yeah, and there's a terrific book by the scholar Ian F. Haney Lopez called White by Law.
Okay.
And he looks at what are called the prerequisite cases. And it's this wonderful exploration of the construction of whiteness through U.S. law.
That's
Terrific.
insane. So I just want to touch on something that you said before, too, because this is absurd. So hypothetically speaking, if we were around those times, you came to my house, killed my family, I would not have any legal ramification to testify against you or say, Dr. Jacqueline Battalora did X, Y, and Z to my family. And essentially, we would just have to just take the loss and move on with our lives.
Absolutely. Because the law said you cannot testify against a white person. I love that you gave that example because it really amplifies this new society that was being created through these laws, right? Because it allows me to dominate as a white person.
This would be the idea of, I hate to say the word, white privilege, or would you argue that
white privilege is the result, white supremacy is the cause.
Okay, got it.
I would say. I mean, academics and most of us white people are a little more comfortable with white privilege, and many of us are not comfortable with any of it at all.
Right.
But I just think if we're honest,
sure.
White privilege is a consequence
derivative of
something else. Yeah, and the derivative is of something called white supremacy built in. Yeah. So we can see from that one law that people of African descent had to learn to become passive and submissive to white people, or else
nothing can you get no.
That's right. But look at what just that one law did. It actually aligned the law with white people and their interests. Right? Like that's and that particular law that prohibited black people from testifying, or people of African descent from testifying against white people. That particular law, I know that it really worked to serve the purposes of the ruling elite because we see it throughout U.S. history. After large numbers of Chinese came to build the Transcontinental Railroad and pan for gold after 1848 in California, guess what? We see that people of Chinese descent were prohibited from testifying against white people. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the U.S. Grew significantly and Mexico shrunk, those lands where Mexicans yesterday were Mexicans living in Mexico, and today they're Mexicans living in the U.S. and they didn't move.
Right.
We see emerge out of those regions laws that prohibited Mexicans who were white by federal law, made blocked from testifying against white people at the state and local level.
So just about everybody who wasn't white at that time got the short end of the stick on this.
Absolutely. Well, it just tells us that law, that approach, really worked.
Right.
It worked to assert white domination, and the other side of it, from a labor perspective, is that it ensured that these people seen as not white would remain cheap and dependent labor.
Right.
Right.
And you better stay in line as well.
Oh, absolutely. So there were so many laws that continued to get passed, and you can really see them through the next quarter of the next century into 1725. And these laws, as we suggested, are radically transform society. But here's one of the crazy parts about this transformation, is that the ruling elite, to so radically alter society, I didn't have to hand over a pence, right, to the poor white people in order to get them to agree to this new arrangement. I didn't have to give any of my resources at all. What they did was they dug out a new bottom to society and tossed people of African descent and members of native tribes within it.
Oh, are you saying essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that essentially people, by creating this social class, the individuals would not be able to rebel anymore, wouldn't think about rebelling anymore because they were now in the white category. And they'd say, at least I'm not African,
Exactly.
so therefore they wouldn't have any reason or thought pattern to want to rebel.
That's right. And if you look, that is exactly right. It worked, right? White worked to divide the 99% from each other, because now there's, if you will, an elite group among the laborers called white laborers, right? Who are never as treated as horribly as people who are seen as not white.
Right.
And the other thing that this new social arrangement did was it created a connection that had never existed before between the ruling elite and this new group of laborers called white laborers. Because if there's one thing the 99% before this time could all agree on, it's that we hated them.
Right.
You know, we hated them. But now the white laborers share something with the ruling elite. And what we share now is a status called white, imbued with the presumption of our superiority.
And they are protected by those laws as well.
Absolutely. And so I even see this in my classroom today, where I have students who feel, white students who feel a greater affinity to a Melania Trump, a Paris Hilton, than they do to their African American, Latinx, Asian colleagues in the classroom.
Do you believe that the majority of this comes from the lack of education that most people, because you know what's so fascinating and kind of horrifying at the same time, and I hate to say both those words at the same time, is that a lot of this stuff I didn't learn in school. I went my entire career in college and high school not knowing any of this. If it wasn't for, again, my father bestowing me with your beautiful book and me reading it on my own volition, I might not have known this stuff. So I'm wondering, and this is a question that's always been in the back of my head, and I wanted to ask you how you feel about this. Do you believe it's miseducation that's causing a lot of these individuals to...
It absolutely is. There may be some people who are in the decision-making position with regard to school textbooks who have an intent to misguide, but I don't think that for most people that's really the case. I think that it is ignorance of a more truthful history. This is how I describe the history we're given in school.
Yes, please.
My audience.
Please do.
So it's like this. It's like my daughter, let's say, on Friday night says, "Hey, Mom, it's Friday," and I say, "You know, what are you going to do?" And she says, "Well, I'm going to go hang out with my really good friend Delcy, and we're just going to hang out with some friends." I say, "You know, great. That's the history we learn in school." What actually happened is that she goes to Delcy's. There's about 200 people, some kegs, some cocaine, and various pharmaceuticals. Right? So she didn't lie to me. Right, so the history we're given
is an abridged version,
but it is so incomplete that it is nothing we could call the truth. So does that make sense? So that's how I see the history we're given. So to me, I want parents of kids to know this information so that we can start demanding of our school boards that we incorporate into social studies and other classes a better truth.
How does this all relate to the society that we're living in now?
Well, I think that white supremacy as a norm, even among those who call ourselves good white liberals, that we have been hidden from the truth of our history that allows us to not see the ways in which we are racist. Because we can only see Timothy McVeigh and those involved in the KKK and neo-Nazis who have a self-conscious white supremacy. But what I learned as I learned this history and dug into my own life as a person trained to be white, right? I wasn't born that way, I was made that way. Like I had to come face to face with the fact that I'm racist, that I absorbed my culture and society's messages that are not very positive toward people of color, and the implications of that for someone who has been in law enforcement, and for someone who is a teacher are huge. Like, what does that say about how I'm treating students in my classroom?
Right.
What does it say about how I'm approaching someone on the street carrying a gun with the legal authorization to take a life?
Right.
So we have had our own white supremacy hidden. We have had our country's social structural white supremacy stripped from what we learn about US history. So we're in this sort of blissful ignorance. And I think Trump's presidency has started to expose some of that in a way that it likely would not have been, but for. So I see that sort of as a silver lining to even while I'm horrified by the policies and of this nation around the globe and the damage to the planet that hopefully we can recover from.
I know.
But I think that what I refer to as everyday white supremacy, that this might be a moment where that's getting exposed. And my hope is that other people like me who find themselves labeled white and want desperately to be a good, just human being, that we are willing to look at the ways in which we have been made white, and that means nothing good.
Right.
Unfortunately. And it's not our fault.
Right.
Again, as Tim Wise says, whiteness has been done to all of us.
Right, exactly. So earlier you had actually given a synopsis in regards to white privilege and white supremacy, and white privilege actually being a derivative of white supremacy.
Yes.
Would you be able to give me a synopsis of what white privilege is?
I'll give a concrete example.
Perfect.
The very first Congress of this nation was tasked with creating all the laws of a brand new country.
Sure.
Included in that were laws concerning immigration and naturalization. And our founders determined that in order to become a naturalized citizen of the United States, one had to be white. That law was in place for more than 150 years. We didn't care if someone fought a war for this country, how much you loved the country, knew its history. What that law did was it made white more valuable in the United States of America as a matter of law than anything else that you can contribute. So that's an example of white supremacy built into our structures. And so white people, even the poorest of white people who immigrated to the United States, even if they didn't know it was a requirement of the law that one had to be white to become a US citizen, got that advantage. That's white privilege. And you don't have to know that you're getting it for it to still be white privilege. You don't have to want it. You don't have to ask for it. Right? Like when I am violating a law technically, like by driving faster than I'm supposed to, I don't really worry that I'm going to be targeted by police because of how I look, because of the melanin in my skin. And I'm not typically afraid of law enforcement when I am pulled over for having done something wrong.
Right.
And that's something that is a privilege of whiteness.
Right.
I don't have to sit my daughter down, who is low-level melanin like me, and explain to her, when you are pulled over by law enforcement, you keep your hands right. Like the whole talk that people who are not white in this country, as responsible parents, have to give to their children, just to ensure that a relatively innocent interaction with law enforcement isn't dead.
It's funny that you said that, because that talk, the hypothetical example you've given, actually was a real example my father did with me.
Of course.
Keep my hands on the steering.
All of my students who don't click off white have that talk, and all of my students who are white don't. They have a different, sometimes, some of them have had some sort of talk, and usually their parents were law enforcement.
Sure.
But it was a very different talk.
Sure. So that's an example of white supremacy, and white privilege is...
Well, white supremacy is the belief that white people are better than, and it's not about an individual, right? Because it's built in the law. In order to naturalize a U.S. citizen, you have to be white. That's white supremacy, and it's structural white supremacy because it's just a matter of law. Nobody asked for it necessarily, and perhaps some people don't even want it. Doesn't matter. It's just the law. And so white privilege is what we get because of that structural advantage, right? I have the privilege of being able to just call myself American. And even linguistically, even if my family came last week to this country and we speak English, I just called American. Other people are called African American, Asian American, Hispanic, Native American. Yeah, and that standard has come about by virtue of founding law, right? Because they created an equation between white and American through our legal structure. And that's one. There are thousands of laws that were built out of the presumption of white people's superiority. There's not an institution in this nation that has grown out of anything other than white supremacy.
You had mentioned about naturalization law. Could you give a brief synopsis as to what that is?
Sure. Immigration law concerns who can come within and exit and come back U.S. borders. Naturalization law concerns those who were not born in a nation but hope to become a citizen of that nation. So you're born somewhere else, and you come to the U.S. and you want to be a U.S. citizen. So naturalization provides the legal process in order to actualize citizenship.
This whole thing, Dr. Battalora, honestly makes my head hurt, and it's so backwards for two reasons. Because if I was born here, right, like if I was an Arawak or a Taino, somebody from the days of Columbus, based off of that law, I wouldn't even be considered a citizen because I wasn't white, correct? And others who came from Europe or any of these corresponding locations could come there, but because they're white, they're white.
Right. Well, you reference actually tribes, and that's a whole other set of laws, because those are by treaties, right? And that is a crazy set of laws, because you have this country refused to allow tribal people to be citizens of the United States, and then this country, our government, told them when they could be citizens, and not only that, but our government has told tribal people when your people can count as tribal people, right? Because they have a financial obligation. Our history is a history of white people stealing land, subjugating, dominating. As a white person, to learn what we have done in the name of whiteness, it could really wreck you on the inside. And I definitely call them the ugly years when I first sort of learned this, and I realized what whiteness meant, and I was really kind of stuck in guilt. And then one day I just made the decision that I'm going to use this frustration and this information to be empowered. And I've never looked back. I mean, but I went through what I call the ugly years, and they were years of like not knowing how to be, not knowing how to acknowledge my whiteness while wanting to reject the power and division parts of it, which is all of it. How do you do that? What does that look like? And we didn't have scholars like Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility and many other things, and Peggy McIntosh, who did the list of white privileges. Anyway, none of that was around to help guide me.
So you had to just take it in all as it is and just deal with it from there. I would imagine that would have been hard to do, and most people probably have trouble with that to this day. They try to just accept that and move forward.
You know what? We wouldn't have a book called White Fragility.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
But for the fact that we resisted incredibly, the resistance makes sense, because when you really come face to face with that truth of what whiteness means, and to have the veil lifted up, that everything around us is made by white people, for their advantage, and that flies in the face of this ideology of equality that we grew up with, and meritocracy. Like, all of that is gone to the wind, because you now see that it's not true, and that in fact it's dangerous because it keeps white supremacy, it nurtures it and passes it generation after generation. And it's, I think some of the lessons that we learn in elementary school are some of the most dangerous.
Right.
You know, that idea that this country is great because anyone can come here. If you work hard enough, you can make it.
Exactly. It's indoctrination.
It is because in that little ideological statement, we completely erase the roadblocks that make success for someone who looks like you 1,000 times more difficult than someone who looks like me, even though I'm female.
My final question for you is, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? What could be done in order to, help our society today or make these things better for individuals?
Well, if I had a wand...
Right. First question, the wand.
Yeah, if I had a wand, oh my gosh, if I had a wand, I would strip away the lies, the ideological lies, the stories, the myths, and the veils that keep us people labeled white from seeing the white supremacy that is all around us and in us. Because I know that most people want to be good people.
Right.
Like, part of what's so hard about confronting and seeing the white supremacy that's everywhere is it flies in the face of so many people's desire to be good, to be just. And we would have if I had that wand, we would have a pathway toward justice that we will never move far on that path until those things are done.